Today's a big day, big morning, excited about this morning, but then also excited about tonight. Big game tonight. So just as a just see where everybody's at on this whole deal that we got going on tonight. How many of you here are cheering for the Eagles? Yeah. Woo, yeah, look at that. Okay. Now, how many of you here are cheering for the Patriots? Oh, I know, it's like the evil empire, right? Yes, you should have heard them last service. Oh my gosh, I thought somebody was going to get hurt. They had a Patriots jersey on. Oh man, I was nervous for the guy. Well, anyway, big game tonight. And again, exciting morning, and so excited to be with you this morning for this time that we'll share together. We're in a series, guys. We're going through the book of Nehemiah. If you're new with us today, welcome. So excited that you're here with us. But you haven't missed much. We're only into the second week of this particular book. And so Nehemiah, he is this guy that we actually don't know a lot about. We do know that his father's name is Hakaliah. We don't know, where did Hakaliah come from? We don't know. We don't know that either. We just know that Nehemiah, Hakaliah, they rhyme, and that's about as far as we go with those guys. We also know that he has a brother named Hanani who is Jewish, and we don't really know anything about him. And there's a great lesson in that perhaps we'll touch on periodically, and that's, it doesn't matter what your roots are, no matter how humble your beginnings might be, that God can still use you in great ways, in mighty ways. And we don't know how Nehemiah got to this position of being the cupbearer in the palace. The cupbearer was the person who would taste the drink of the king before the king would actually partake of that drink. Assassinations by poisoning were very common in this day, and so the cupbearer would help to keep that from taking place. And so Nehemiah is in this position. And his heart breaks as he receives news of the condition of Jerusalem. The condition of Jerusalem is this, that the walls are torn down, and Nehemiah wants to go back and he wants to rebuild those walls. But not just rebuild the walls, also rebuild the people there. Because he hears that they are in trouble. They're in disgrace. They're in trouble because the walls, that was their security in this day. You would have been better off in this particular time to have a wall and no army than to have an army with no wall. And so Jerusalem has no wall. The people are in trouble, but then they're also disgraced. They're disgraced because they have brought in the practices and the traditions of these other religions, these other people groups that surround them. And so now their faith is incredibly compromised. And so Nehemiah receives word of this, and his heart just breaks. And he has what you would call that Popeye moment. We talked about that last Sunday, that Popeye moment. Popeye had a girlfriend named Olive Oil. When Olive Oil was in trouble, Popeye would say this phrase, "I've had all I can stand, I can't stand no more," and he would just barrel ahead to fix the situation, to help the situation. And we have those moments in life, where we've had all we can stand and we can't stand no more. It's when you sit down with your wife or your husband and you say, you know what? Our marriage is meant to be so much more than this. It's when you evaluate your relationship with the child and you say, I've raised you and I love you and there's so much more to our relationship than what this has become. It's when you evaluate your finances or whatever the area might be, and you just say, I've had all I can stand with this. I have to change directions. Something has to be different going forward. And maybe even evaluate your relationship with God, your faith. And you're just saying, I'm tired of going through the motions. Or you're tired of just leaning into the world and what the world offers you, and you say, I'm tired of what that offers me and what that has given me, and so I'm here and I want to learn about Jesus. I want to learn about God because I've had all I can stand with that thing, and so I'm here. And so we come to these moments. And what does Nehemiah do when he comes to that moment? Well, he's not Popeye, and he doesn't run into the situation head first trying to change it. Instead, what we're going to find today and what we're going to hone in the majority of our time today is Nehemiah prays. He takes time to pray, and then seemingly to plan as well, but certainly to pray. For 4 months, he just prays about what he is going to do about this situation in Jerusalem that has just broken his heart. And why does he do that? Because there's power in prayer. You can't read the Bible and not walk away with that conclusion that there is significant power in prayer. Jesus told a parable of the persistent widow because there is power. Prayer makes a difference. And so we're going to talk about prayer. And prayer might even arguably be more significant than any of the other religious activities that we fulfill in our lives. I love what R.A. Torrey says about this. He has an incredible quote from over 100 years ago in his book, How to Pray, a book that you can even pick up in our bookstore. I would encourage you to do that as we discuss the topic of pray. But in this book, this is what he says. The devil laughs as he looks at the church today and says to himself, you can have your Sunday schools, your small groups, your young men's Christian associations, and your women's Christian unions, your institutional churches, your community churches, your grand choirs, and your fine music, your brilliant preachers, and your revival efforts too. If you don't bring the power of Almighty God into them by earnest, persistent, believing, mighty prayer. There's power in prayer. And unfortunately, we don't always know how to pray, though, as we come to these particular life-changing types of moments, these things that we want to change. It's kind of like the fire extinguisher in my house. I've got a fire extinguisher in my garage. It gives me comfort that I have this fire extinguisher that is there, but I don't know how to use it. I've never used it, but I'm glad that it's there. I'm hopeful that if I would ever need to use it, that the situation wouldn't be so bad that I couldn't get the fire extinguisher and then use it. I'm sure it's not that hard. I just don't know how to use it. I wonder if maybe we've got some fires in our lives, but we don't know how to pray about them. There was a survey done by This Week magazine in which the question was asked of church-going people, what would you like your preacher to talk about this Sunday? The number one answer they received was, how to pray more effectively. And so today, as we look into the story of Nehemiah, in particular into these verses 5 through 11, I believe that we are going to find some principles about prayer that are going to help us to pray more effectively as we come into these challenging situations that we're dealing with, as we consider perhaps even the fires of our lives. And so we're going to pick up in verse 5 of Nehemiah chapter 1, and this is what it says. Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and his commandments. And so he says, the God of heaven. And he refers to the God of heaven not to give God an address. God is omnipresent. If you want to send God a letter, he's not saying here's where God is. He's in heaven. That's not what God is doing. It's not what he's saying here of God. He's saying the God of heaven. He's saying God is sovereign over heaven as he is over earth and all of creation. And also Nehemiah, over this man who you serve, the most powerful man in the world, Artaxerxes. God is sovereign over all things and all people. And he keeps his covenant of love with those who love him, and he keeps his commandments. And just before that, he says, the great and awesome God. And he uses this word awesome. I love that he uses this word awesome. We use awesome for everything, don't we? Cheese fries are awesome. Ice cream is awesome. Your girlfriend's awesome. Your boyfriend's awesome. Your house is awesome. Your job's awesome. The Philadelphia Eagles are awesome. The word awesome actually means when something strikes awe, dread, and fear in you. That's what the word awesome actually means, but we use awesome for everything, and so when everything is awesome, nothing is awesome. There was a commercial from 1981 for a Datsun. Did any of you here ever drive a Datsun? Anybody here have a Datsun? Yeah, we had some Datsuns. Okay, so you know. So there was this commercial in 1981 for a Datsun car. You can go on the internet and watch the commercial. But the commentator behind the commercial as the Datsun is driving through the streets would say, there is a new beast on the streets. And then this Datsun would drive by. And even the competition is saying that it is awesome. And then as the car drives by, there's this close-up on the license plate that says, awesome. Now, there's a lot of things that a Datsun was. But awesome is not one of them. But we've defined so many things as awesome that we lose sight of what it means when we read in here the scriptures that God is awesome. He's incredible. He's beyond comprehension. And so what Nehemiah opens with here, the first principle that we learn is this, is that God is great. Nehemiah doesn't even get to his request until the last verse of this particular passage of Scripture that we are going to look at. And he opens up with first by saying, God is great. I have a friend of mine who, when he is praying with his children at night, he'll say a sentence and then he'll have them say one word that finishes the sentence. And so he'll say something along the lines of, I love God because, and then his child is supposed to finish the sentence. I mean, it's a great thing for you to do, even as a parent, as you're considering how great God is. And so often they'll finish the sentence with, God is, merciful. I love God because he's merciful, he's compassionate, he's gracious, he's so loving and righteous and just. But my friend says they often, almost always come back to God is great. Ask yourself the question, is God greater than your problems? Or are your problems greater than God? If we examine our concern, our anxiety, how it is that we work through situations, unfortunately, while we would never admit it, we often function as though our problems are greater than God. And maybe even Jesus realized this in Matthew chapter 21 as he was talking, this tendency of ours, as he was talking to his disciples. And he said to them, and they're in Jerusalem, and he's looking up into the mountains and these hills there, and he says, he's talking about prayer, and he says, if you just have enough faith to say to that mountain there, throw yourself in the sea, it will be done. And what Jesus was teaching his disciples in that moment, and he's teaching us is this, is that don't focus so much on the mountain in front of you that you forget about the mountain mover above you. Don't focus so much on the metaphorical mountain that is the problem before you that you forget about the one above you that is the God of heaven. He is sovereign over all these problems, over all these issues. Don't forget about him as you try to pray through and work through these things. And so Nehemiah first starts with how great God is, because he's not going to just dive in on the problem, because as soon as we do that, we begin to think, oh man, I don't know if God can work this out. I don't know how this is going to play out. And so Nehemiah first starts by centering himself on the greatness of God. And then he goes on, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. And in this context, we would define a servant as somebody who is going to make someone else's priority their priority. That's what it means. That's what Nehemiah is saying here. God, we are your servants. Your priorities are our priorities. Our priorities don't even exist anymore. And so we are here for you, God. And so lend your ear to us. Hear me, God. It's almost as if he's hearkening back to the book of Exodus, where he remembers how God heard the groans and the cries of the Israelite people as they were in slavery in Egypt. He's saying, hear us again like that, God. We need that kind of delivery again. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. We acted very wickedly toward you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. And so he enters in by acknowledging his own failures and even the failures of all of his people. There's power in praying that God would forgive other people. We ought to do that for one another. They might not even know that. They don't have to know that. Probably better that they don't know it, but we ought to pray for them. I had been a Christian for maybe a month or two, so I had no idea. I still don't really know what I'm doing with Christianity, but I really had less of an idea then. And so I was in church, and I was in church, and I had these friends of mine that were going out that night they were going to run the streets, clubs, party, drinking, all that stuff. And I went to church instead. And so they invited me. I said, no, I'm going to go to church. And it was one of those great conflictions. Do I go? Do I not go? That looks like fun. So I don't think I should do it. So I'm going to go to church. I mean, just all kinds of things in my head I was working through at the time. I've probably taken communion hundreds of times, maybe even 1,000 in my life. Some of you have probably taken communion thousands of times in your life. I can't remember taking communion any time but this once. All of the times I've taken communion, I only remember doing it one time. And so I received the bread, I received the juice that represents Christ's body, and I just started praying, and I'm like, God, forgive me of my sins. I mean, I've got a litany of them, and so I began to ask for God's forgiveness. And then in the midst of that, I said, I don't know if I should, and this was the essence of what I prayed. It was too long ago to remember my exact words, but I said, God, I don't know what they're doing. You know what my friends are doing. Father, forgive them of their sins. Father, help them to find your way and your will in all of this. And it was one of the most surreal and euphoric moments of communion I've ever had in my entire life. I'll never forget it. There's power in praying for other people and praying that God would forgive them. In Nehemiah, he exemplifies that for us. And so the second principle that we learn here, though, in this is by remembering as we come to God that we are sinners. I am a sinner. I have Romans 3:23. We have all fallen short of the glory of God. As David prayed in Psalm 51, God, against you and you alone have I sinned. And that is what we see here as Nehemiah prays, that he has sinned against God, that we all have sinned against God. And here's what that does. A few things, that by acknowledging that we have fallen short in our prayers, we come to God and we ask for forgiveness. That does a couple things for us. The first thing is that it helps us to remember that whatever we receive from God, it's not by our merit, but his mercy. And so when God gives you that answer and God intervenes into your life and an amazing thing happens, it's not because we earned it. It's because God in his graciousness and his mercy has given it to us. It also helps us as we come to God and say, I know I've messed up, I need your forgiveness. It helps us to lose that sense of entitlement. Because some of you, you're discouraged right now. You're maybe mad at God. He isn't answering your prayers. And often when we find that, often when I get to that place, it's because I've come to God with a sense of entitlement. But you know what? If I've fallen short of his glory, I lose some of that sense of entitlement. It's hard, but I begin to lose some of that sense of entitlement when I know I've messed up. And here's the third thing it allows us to do. It helps us to get ourselves right with God. In his book, Too Busy Not to Pray, Bill Hybels speaks of confession, and he tells us, he gives a story, a hypothetical story. And he says, the importance of confession is this. Imagine that you're cutting your yard. You're mowing your lawn one day. And you remember that your neighbor has this really nice line trimmer that he has said that anytime you would like to borrow it, you can. You just have to come over and ask for it. And so you're mowing your lawn and you realize that the grass is starting to grow over top of the sidewalk and you really want to cut it in pretty tight. And so you decide you're going to go and take him up on the offer. Well, this neighbor of yours also has this little dog. It's this little like yipper dog. And it's the kind of dog with a little head and a little mouth, and it's a little dog. The dog has the little dog syndrome. And so the dog wants to like fight you when he sees you. He's barking at you. And so you begin to walk up through the sidewalk and into your neighbor's property, and the dog just runs after you, and he starts nipping at you. And he's like nipping at you and barking at you, nipping at you and barking at you, and you're like, you got to be kidding me. You can't be more than 10 pounds, and you're doing, what are you doing, dog? And then the dog, as you're about to go to your neighbor, the dog reaches out and he just grabs a hold of the back of your Achilles. He just, good bite there. And I mean, you've had enough at that point of this dog. And so you just decide to give that dog one little swift kick. And you just go, and just kick that dog. And it yelps, it goes, yip, 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 yip. And I love dogs, by the way, just qualify that, okay? I already received comments about this. I love dogs. Not so sure about cats, but I do like dogs. So, but you decide to just kick that dog, and it just yelps away, and it runs off, and it knows it's never going to bite you again, and you feel good about it, and then you look up, and there's your neighbor, and he saw everything. Now, is that a good time to ask him for something? No, you need to make some things right. You need to make some amends here. And maybe that's what we need to remember when we come to God with some of our requests, our petitions of him. We need to remember that we need to get ourselves right with him. We need to get our heart right with him. And so Nehemiah doesn't just jump into a request here. There's much to request, but he goes to God and he says, God, we have sinned. We have fallen so short of your glory, and he's trying to make himself right with God. And then he goes on in verse 8, remember the instructions you gave your servants servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. And that was exactly what happened. They were unfaithful. God scattered them all throughout the known world in a variety of different nations. God is absolutely fulfilling what it is that he said he would do. It's same as when you tell one of your kids, if you do that, you're going to get a timeout. You're going to get a spanking. You're going to get in trouble if you do this. And they did it. And God scattered them throughout the nations. It's kind of harsh, right, for a loving God? But yeah, if you just hone into that, yes, that is absolutely the truth. But that's where we go wrong, because there's more to it. But you said, if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, and you could absolutely define where the Israelites were as the farthest horizon they could imagine, 800 miles away from Jerusalem, the farthest horizon. Even if you're there, I will gather you back from there and bring them to the place I've chosen as a dwelling for my name. And what Nehemiah is doing here is he is dialing into God's faithfulness. He's saying, God, you were faithful with our discipline. And so, Father, as we come back to you now, please be faithful. Please be faithful with your graciousness and your mercifulness and bring us back to the city where your name resides. The third thing that we need to remember when we pray is that the principle is that God is faithful. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13, it says that even when we are faithless, God is still faithful, for he cannot disown himself. And what does it look like for you when you're faithless? Often for us, it looks like we have to have control. I get that. I struggle with that. At sometimes when we're faithless, we feel like we need to be passive, because what if we're wrong? And so we don't do anything. Faithlessness, it plays itself out in our lives in a variety of different ways. But even when we're faithless, God is he is ultimately still faithful. And I'll come back to again what he said there. You said you would scatter us, but if we turn back to you, you'll bring us back. And what we learn here, and this is so critical for us as Christians to understand, is that God is not in the business of paying you back. He is in the business of bringing you back. The purpose, as Hebrews 12 tells us, that when God disciplines us, it is to show us and demonstrate for us the love that he has for us. Yes, there will be consequences when we turn from him, but when we come back to him, that's where we experience his blessing and his favor. That in the Old Testament, God was never trying to pay the Israelites back. He was always trying to bring them back to the city where his name resided, which was Jerusalem. And that's kind of the advantage that we have now when we see the big picture, okay? Because we have the Bible. There was a commercial that came out a little while back from a news organization. In this commercial, there's a woman. She's in a car, and she's minding her own business. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this man runs up beside the car, rips the door open, drags the woman out of there, and you're just, like your stomach's in knots because you think she's going to get hurt. And then the camera pans back. You see that the car is actually on fire. And then the tagline for the commercial is, sometimes it's good to see the big picture. And then it says, and Channel 10 News wants to give you the big picture or something. I don't know. The Bible gives us the big picture. And if we aren't careful, we can get so honed in on a particular moment, one conversation, one evaluation, one instance in which there's a problem there for us. We get so honed in on that moment that we forget about the big picture. We forget about, in the grand scheme of things, God is going to be faithful. I was just talking with a couple between services. They've got grandchildren. They've got some children of theirs that were hoping to adopt 2 children. And those children, they are going to go back into being with their mother. And these grandparents are just heartbroken. They don't understand why this is happening. And the comment that was made to me from him was, sometimes you just got to try to see the big picture. And hopefully God has a greater plan in all of this than what we're just seeing in this particular moment. as their families' hearts are just broken. You got to remember that God, He is faithful. And then finally, after all of that, you can get to the last part here in verse 10. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeem by your great strength and your mighty hand. Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. And in light of that, also revering your city, because your name resides upon Jerusalem. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man, Artaxerxes. And then he closes, I was a cupbearer to the king. And I love the way he closes there, because in closing there, he acknowledges who he is. That ultimately the king can tell him no, and he will never be allowed to bring this request to the king again. If he were to do that, he would lose his position of influence. He would lose everything that he has. He might even lose his life. He has one shot, and he says, God, I'm just a cupbearer. I need your help. I need your intervention. Proverbs chapter 21, verse 1 says that in the Lord's hands lie the heart of the king. And Nehemiah is saying, God, I need you in this moment. And that's the fourth principle that we have to remember when we're praying, is that we need God's help. I need God's help. It's kind of like in John 15, Jesus tells us this. He says, I'm the vine, you're the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, then you'll bear much fruit. But apart from me, you can do nothing. And here's what we do, though. We forget how much we need God in these situations, and we become the vine. And so we're squeezing the vine, we're trying to produce the fruit, and we're working hard. We're trying to get everything in order. And then, apart from him, nothing happens. And we have to just come back to this place where we continually and regularly remember that we need him. And that's why Jesus came, because we need him. In theological circles, there's something known as typology. It's where it's how the Old Testament relates to the New Testament. Anytime you see a rescuer in the Old Testament, you have to ask yourself, how does this person foreshadow Christ for us? Because that's exactly what Nehemiah does here. Nehemiah is a man who came from a humble beginning. Jesus came from a humble beginning as he was born in a stable. Nehemiah was a man that was in a palace, but he would give up the palace to go to Jerusalem to do a great work for God's people. Jesus was in heaven, and he would give up the riches of heaven to come to Jerusalem to do a great work for God's people in dying for us on the cross. Nehemiah, he would be on his knees for 4 months pleading for God's people. God, we want to come back to you. Bring us back to you. Draw us back together to your city, to your temple, to where your name resides. In John 17, Jesus, he prays that we would all come together, that we would unite under his name, and that we would then pursue and fulfill the mission that he has called us all to. It's in Jesus that we realize how much we really need God. And so whatever the thing is that you come here with, that I've had all I can stand and I can't stand no more type of moment, whatever that is for you, remember how great God is. Remember that whatever happens, that ultimately we have all fallen short of the glory of God. We don't deserve anything from God. Remember that he's faithful. Don't just hone in on the moment, that inevitably he's going to work it all out. And just remember that you need his help no matter what. Because it can seem like we're surrounded and we've got all these things warring against us. And we forget that God is the one that's really surrounding us. And that in Christ we are all more than conquerors. And that he will ultimately always lead us through to the end. I mean, in the end, the war has ultimately already been won. We've just got these little battles that are being fought here and there. And so let us continue to remember that. And remember that even as we sing these words to this next song. Let's have a word of prayer, and then Brandon is going to continue to lead us in worship. Thank you, Father, that you are so great. Dear God, even though we have fallen short of your glory and we have sinned against you, that you are still so gracious and merciful, that you are drawing us back to you from whatever distant land that we might be in. We're grateful for your faithfulness, even in spite of our unfaithfulness. In whatever area that we need you to intervene in our lives, God, we just ask that you would do just that. Not because we deserve it, but Father, because we are servants of yours. Your priorities are our priorities. And we give you all this in Jesus' name.